Next to King Arthur, Robin Hood is the most famous of British heroes, and he shares with King Arthur the indignity of having his existence doubted by modern scholarship. The folklorist, Lord Raglan, concluded that he was really a Celtic god, while in The God of the Witches, Margaret Murray argues that his real name means Robin of the Hood, and that he was probably the devil or horned god in ancient witchcraft festivals. Yet there is also convincing evidence that Robin was indeed a real person, and that, as the ballads declare and the bards sing, he plundered the king's deer in Sherwood Forest, and had a long-standing feud with the Sheriff of Nottingham. The first literary reference to Robin Hood occurs in William Langland's Piers Plowman, dating from around 1377. Langland made a piece to remark that he could not say his paternoster without making mistakes, but I know rhymes of Robin Hood and Randolph Earl of Chester. So there was already ballads of Robin Hood by that date. In 1510, Wynkyn de Worde, one of the earliest printers, brought out A Little Guest of Robin Hood, which did for Robin Hood what Malory had done for King Arthur in the middle of the previous century. And by that time, he appears in Sir Walter Scott's Ivanhoe of 1847. Robin had become the boon companion and ally of Richard the Lionheart, the heroic outlaw of the woods. All that was needed then was from some folklorists to notice how often Robin Hood's name is associated with the folk festivals, like the Hobby Horse ceremony, which takes place on May Day in Padstow, Cornwall, to suggest that Robin Hood was really Robin Hood, and that his name is derived from the Norse god Woden. In fact, he appears as Robin Hood in T.H. White's Sword in the Stone, in which he becomes a contemporary of King Arthur, who, if he ever existed, was said to have died AD 540. Those who assume there is no smoke without fire are inclined to believe that Robin Hood was a real outlaw who had sometime lived in Sherwood Forest, and who became so popular during his own lifetime that, like Billy the Kid in America, he soon became the subject of tales and ballads. Yet it seems unlikely that he was around as early as Richard the Lionheart, who died in 1199. Or he would surely have been mentioned in manuscripts before Piers Plowman 2 centuries later. In the Chronicle of Scotland, written about 1420, Andrew Whittington refers to Robin Hood and Little John for the year 1283, which sounds altogether more likely about a century before Piers Plowman. But where precisely did he operate? One important clue is that there is a small fishing town called Robin's Hood Bay in Yorkshire, not far from Whitby, and that upon the nearby moors there are 2 termini, or boroughs, called Robin Hood's Butts. Another, in that in medieval England, the Forest of Barnsdale in Yorkshire joined Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire. A 16th century life of Robin Hood, among the Sloane manuscripts, says he was born in Locksley in Yorkshire about 1160. The Chronicle of Scotland associates Robin with Barnsale, presumably Barnsdale, so the evidence suggests that he was a Yorkshireman. Later legends declare that he was Sir Robin of Locksley, or even the Earl of Huntingdon, but it is clear from the earlier ballads that he was a yeoman, a farmer who owned his own land, and that this is a partly why he became such a hero, not because he was a nobleman, but because he was a representative of the people. A small tenant farmer would be only one stage above a landless peasant. One of the most important clues of Robin's identity emerged in the mid-19th century, when the Historic Documents Commission was cataloguing thousands of documents which represented 8 centuries of British history. It was in 1852 that the antiquarian Joseph Hunter claimed that he had stumbled upon a man who sounded as if he might be the actual Robin Hood. His name was in fact Robert, and he was the son of Adam Hood, a forester in the service of the Earl de Warenne. Robin was simply a diminutive of Robert, not in those days a name in his own right. He was born about 1280, and on the 20th of January 1316, Robert Hood and his wife Matilda paid 2 shillings for permission to take a piece of the Earl's waste ground in Bick Hill, or Bitch Hill, in Wakefield. It was merely the size of a kitchen garden, 30 feet long by 16 feet wide. The rent for this was 6pence a year. The Manor Court Roll for 1357 shows a house formerly the property of Robert Hood on this site, so by the time Robert Hood was presumably dead. Now, 1316 was midway through the reign of Edward II, the foppish king who was finally murdered by having a red-hot spit inserted into his entrails in September 1327. After his coronation in 1307, he dismissed his father's ministers and judges and made his lover, Piers Gaveston, Earl of Cornwall, to the fury of his barons. It was most powerful of these, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, who forced Edward to accept the rule of 28 barons, called ordainers, and who finally executed Piers Gaveston in 1312. Edward's lack of attention to affairs of state allowed the Scots, among whom his father Edward I had fought so successfully, to throw off the English yoke. Edward II was defeated at Bannockburn in 1314, 2 years before Robin Hood hired the piece of waste ground and set up home with his wife Matilda. So it is understandable that when the Earl of Warren was ordered by the king to raise a troop to fight the Scots, Robert Hood failed to oblige, and the records show that he was accordingly fined. But when a second muster was raised in 1317, Hood's name was not listed among those fined, which led J.W. Walker, a modern historian, to conclude that this time Robin Hood joined the army. 5 years later, it was the Earl of Lancaster who raised the army to fight against the king. Again, Hood's name is not amongst those fined, so it would seem that he answered the summons. Lancaster's army was defeated at Boroughbridge, and Lancaster was captured and beheaded. The quarrel had been about Edward's new favourites, the Despensers, father and son, who had been forced to banish. Now, he was able to recall them. Many of Lancaster's supporters were declared outlaws, and Walker discovered a document that stated that a building of 5 rooms on Bitch Hill, Wakefield, was among the property confiscated. Walker believes that this was Robert Hood's home, and that the outlaw now took refuge in the nearby forest of Barnsdale, where he soon became a highly successful bandit. Now it must be understood that if Robin Hood had the legendary Robin Hood reputation and he took forest refuge, living off the deer population, he was risking horrible penalties. When William the Conqueror brought the Normans to England, he declared that the forests, which covered a third of the land, were his own private property, and any peasant who killed deer risked being flayed alive. Under the William the Saxons suffered much pain and misery. 2.5 centuries later, the Normans regarded themselves as Englishmen, and the French language had ceased to be used in England, but the laws were still harsh. The forest laws had been mitigated so that a man could no longer have his hands or lips sliced off for poaching a deer, but the penalty was still a heavy fine, a year's imprisonment, and sureties for his future good behaviour. If he could not find guarantors, he had to abjure the realm, which means to quit the country forever. The Battle of Boroughbridge was fought on the 16th of March 1322, near the Ure River in Yorkshire. Dismounted men-at-arms and archers drove back the cavalry. Then another royalist army moved up behind the rebels and forced them to surrender. Lancaster was captured and tried. Evidence revealed that he had been contemplating alliance with the king's old enemy Robert the Bruce. Lancaster, the king's cousin, was beheaded, and Robin Hood, deprived of his home, became an outlaw in the king's forest. But if Walker is correct in identifying Robert Hood of Wakefield as Robin Hood, he was not an outlaw for long. In the spring of the following year, the king had made a progress through the north of England, reaching York on the 1st of May. From the 16th of May to the 21st of May, he stayed at Rothwell, between Wakefield and Leeds, and spent 3 days hunting at Plumpton Park in Knaresborough Forest. And the little guest makes this visit a part of the Robin Hood story, describing how the king came to Plumpton Park and failed to miss many of the deer. Where the king was accustomed to seeing herds of deer, now he could see only one deer that bore him any good horn, which made the king swear by the Trinity, "I wish I could lay my hands on Robin Hood. I wold I had Robin Hood. Within I might see him." So according to this ballad, one of the foresters suggested that the king should disguise himself as an abbot, riding through the greenwood with a band of monks. The ruse was successful. Robin and his men stopped the abbot, but recognised him instantly as the king, and the king therefore found Robin so likeable that he invited him to join the royal household as a vadlet, a gentleman of the royal bedchamber. The king continued on his travels until February 1324. Then he returned to Westminster. The royal household accounts for a full record payment of this past month's wages of Robin Hood and 28 others. The first record of a payment to Robin Hood is in the previous June. The ballad tells us that, after being a servant of the king for somewhat over a year, Robin asked the king's permission to return to Barnsdale, and the royal household accounts for November 1324 record that Robin Hood, formerly one of their porters, had been given 5 shillings. The king's fortunes took a downward spiral after Robin's departure. He had recalled the banished Despensers, and the younger of the two had become his favourite, to the disgust of the queen, who had already had to contend with Piers Gaveston. Since she was a Frenchwoman, daughter of Philip the Fair, and now she began to take a romantic interest in an unpleasant and ambitious young barrel called Roger de Mortimer, who had been thrown into the Tower for his opposition to the Despensers. Queen Isabella became his mistress, and it was probably she who plotted Mortimer's escape. He fled to Paris, and was joined there by Isabella, who was on a mission for the king. They landed at Orwell in Suffolk, with an army of almost 3,000. When the king heard the news, he fled and was captured and imprisoned in Berkeley Castle. He was forced to abdicate, and his son, aged 15, was crowned Edward III. On the night of the 21st of September 1327, horrible screams rang through the castle. The next morning it was announced that the king had died of natural causes. There were no marks on his body, but it said that his features were still contorted with agony. A chronicle of some 30 years later states that 3 assassins entered his cell when he was asleep, held down his upper half with a table, then a horn was inserted into the anal orifice, and a red-hot iron bar was used to burn out the king's insides. Mortimer and Isabella ruled England as regents for 4 years. Then the young king asserted himself, had Mortimer seized in Nottingham Castle, and had him executed as a traitor at Tyburn. The loss of her lover almost drove the queen mad, but she was restored to favour and lived on for another 28 years. It is of course conceivable that Robin Hood, who lived in Edward's reign, had no connection with the legendary outlaw Sherwood Forest. One reference book, Who's Who in History, said that he was alive in 1230, in the reign of Henry III, on the grounds that record shows that the Sheriff of Yorkshire sold his possessions in that year for 32 shillings and 6 ducats when he became an outlaw. But the same reference book admits that Robin Hood of the Wakefield is also a good contender. There is something to be said for the earlier dating, for it would be given more time for the legend of Robin Hood to spread throughout England. But then there's also a great deal to be said for Robin Hood of Wakefield. If he became an outlaw in 1322 as a result of the Lancaster Rebellion, then he spent only 1 year in Sherwood Forest before the king pardoned him. The story of his pardon of the homosexual king certainly rings true, as does his appointment as a gentleman of the bedchamber. It is unnatural to speculate that he may have found that his duties in the bedchamber involved more than he bargained for, although at this time the king's favourite was the younger Hugh le Despencer, executed by Mortimer and Isabella in 1326. So he returned to the Greenwood and became a hero of legend. We do not know whether he became the arch-enemy of the Sheriff of Nottingham, but the Sheriff, who would be the equivalent of a modern-day constable, would have been responsible for law and order in Nottinghamshire and South Yorkshire, and would certainly have represented a band of outlaws who lived off the king's deer. One chronicle states that Robin had a retreat in what became known as Robin Hood's Bay in Yorkshire, and ships in which he could escape to sea. He is also said to have operated as far afield as Cumberland. If a concerted effort had been made to flush him out, it would probably have succeeded, but most of the peasants and tenant farmers would have been on Robin's side. There had been a long time when the forests of England were common land, and half-starved peasantry must have felt that it was highly unreasonable that thousands of square miles of forest should be reserved for the king's hunting, when the king could not make use of a fraction of that area. But that could become another reason why Robin was allowed to operate without too much opposition. When he was at court, he must surely have met the 14-year-old boy king who would become Edward III, and Edward would be of exactly the right age to look with admiration upon the famous outlaw. This is only speculation, but it could undoubtedly explain why Robin was allowed to become the legendary bane of authority in the last decades of his life. Authority has its own ways of striking back though. According to the Sloane manuscript, Robin fell ill and went to his cousin, the prioress of Kirklees, to be bled, the standard procedure for treating any illness in those days. She decided to avenge the church he had robbed and allowed him to bleed to death. Another account says that she betrayed him at the request of her lover, Sir Roger de Lancaster. Still, another source states that the man responsible for Robin's death was a monk, who was called in to attend him and who decided that the outlaw would be better off dead. He was buried in the grounds of the nunnery, with a bow shot of his walls. Grafton's chronicle of 1562 says he was buried under an inscribed stone, and a century later another chronicle reported that his tomb, with a plain cross on a flat stone, could be seen in the cemetery. In 1665, Dr. Nathaniel Johnston made a drawing of it. Gough's Pastoral Monuments also has an engraving of the tombstone. In the early 19th century, navvies building a railway broke up the stone. It is said that they believed its chips to be a cure for toothache, so the last trace of the real existence of Robin Hood disappeared. But by this time the grave of the prioress had been discovered among the ruins of the nunnery, and it bore some resemblance to the tomb of Robin Hood. It also mentions her name, Elizabeth Stainton. The real significance of Robin Hood is that he lived in a century when the peasants were beginning to feel an increasing resentment about their condition, a resentment that expressed itself in the revolutionary doctrines of John Ball, and which exploded in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, only a short time after Robin is first mentioned in print in Langland. The Peasants' Revolt is generally considered to mark the end of the Middle Ages, but it is now the ballads of Robin Hood that we can see that the state of mind known as the Middle Ages is coming to an end.